Hi, Brit.
Hi, Christian.
Welcome to the Superhuman Mind blog. Today we're going
Hi.
to talk about anxious attachment style.
Right. So last week we talked about the avoidant attachment style. Now we're talking about the anxious attachment style, which is also sometimes known as the dependent or clingy or codependent attachment style. So how does that attachment style differ from the avoidant attachment style, Christian?
So, whereas the avoidant attachment style involves kind of dismissing the feelings of a partner because or your own feelings because of your own hangups in the relationship. The anxious style is to kind of go the opposite direction and become obsessive or clingy or really fearful of the other person's detachment.
Yeah. So
So,
it's a terrible mix if you have one person with avoidant an
right.
avoidant attachment style and one person with an anxious attachment style, because you will have this push from the one side and this pull from the other side.
Which seems like it could be a stalking relationship at some point.
Yeah, it could end up with that. It rarely works when it's one person is very dependent and the other person is very independent, or one person is avoidant and the other person is anxious in the attachment style. So why do you think that people develop an anxious attachment style as opposed to an avoidant? It all is grounded, of course, in an insecure attachment style. But why do you think that some people develop the anxious attachment style as opposed to the avoidant?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with past experience. So, either growing up or in prior relationships, usually the anxious person uh, found that the only way to get the attention of their parent or significant other um, was to basically nag them into it, or be very watchful over them to constantly make sure that they were getting the attention that they wanted.
Right.
So I think that's one reason why. Um, I think, of course, it could also you could have not had the experience of that of acting like that and having that work before, but then maybe be so worried about your current relationship going going wrong somewhere that you kind of become that way to try to avoid that from happening.
Mistakenly, right?
Right,
Because
right,
you're gonna push the other person away.
right.
So yeah, yeah. I think maybe it could also be a series of failed relationships
Mm,
where the other person pulls away, perhaps in the relationship,
mm,
and the relationship fails, and then the person left behind might then in a new relationship employ this strategy to prevent that from happening again, although the strategy is really bad, right? So the strategy is to monitor the other person and demand their time and check up on them, maybe follow them around, make sure that they know who they talk to on Messenger or via text and so on.
So how does it? So a lot of those characteristics also sound like abuse, right?
Yeah,
Where an abusive spouse or significant other tries to control the behavior of the other individual, and so what? So how do you know when? How do you distinguish regular anxious attachment behavior from abuse?
yeah. When it becomes so intrusive, I think that it really is psychologically damaging to the other person. So there are cases of verbal and emotional abuse which consist in that kind of behavior, where the other person needs to know the whereabout of the other person constantly and is controlling who they can see, when they can see them, when they can leave the house even. So when it sort of becomes really psychologically demanding for the other person, I think it has become a kind of abuse as opposed to just an anxious attachment style. Of course, the anxious attachment style, if it's very sort of, if the behaviors are very, very moderate, they can be expressions of affection for the other partner, right? If you have a partner who doesn't care at all, you're gonna find that something is wrong. So if you have a partner who cares a little bit about what you're doing and when you're doing it, that's perhaps sort of a healthy amount of anxious attachment, as opposed to someone who doesn't care at all. But then when it becomes really, really extreme, it becomes a form of abuse. And I think that is what is essential to a lot of verbal and emotional abuses, a sort of extreme anxious attachment style.
Mm-hmm. So do you think that somebody can be both anxious and avoidant at the same time?
I think it's possible. I think that it could be situational. That a person could have a relationship where the relationship, because of the other person's behavior, makes them more anxious and dependent and clingy. And then in another relationship, they might be more avoidant because of the other person's behavior. Mm-hmm. What do you think there could be other factors that could make you alternate?
Well, I just kind of think about, well, I'm not sure because I've never been in a relationship like that. But sometimes it seems like I've observed other relationships where the people are kind of hot and cold back and forth.
Oh,
so
yeah.
the
Right.
One
yeah.
person
So there's a certain relationship dynamic
mm-hmm.
that that can be common in some kinds of also usually unhealthy relationships where at one point the one person is sort of pushing and then towards sort of getting more time from the other person, but then the dynamic turns around for reasons that can have to do with something to do with the situation or the stage of the relationship. Is that the kind of relationship you had in mind?
Yeah, and I'm kind of wondering, do you think if that is kind of a manifestation of a true insecure attachment style, or is it a different thing that kind of causes the same symptoms?
I think it's probably not a manifestation of a true anxious attachment style if you sometimes push and then you sometimes pull away, right? I think that it's to some extent it's natural. If the other person is pulling away, it's natural to push a little more. It may not be the best thing to do, but it's natural to feel that way, that you need to get the other person's attention because they're sort of slipping away. And then if the other person is attending more to you, you're more likely to sit back and relax, or maybe even become sort of overwhelmed by the sudden affection of the other partner. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that necessarily reflects an underlying anxious attachment style or avoidant attachment style. I think that can just be a feature of sort of the natural way to react to people who are pulling away or people who are pushing too much. That can be sort of a natural reaction to that. That if you are securely attached, you would naturally react that way. Maybe you have some conceptual resources that will allow you to prevent you from acting that way. But it's not an unnatural way to react. So that if someone is slipping away, you want to prevent them from doing that. So you are more likely to give them affection and try to make up for the problems in the relationship that way. But what do you think is the right way to act in the case where, say, one person is starting to pull away?
Well, all of the love movies tell us that you're supposed to make some ridiculous overture, and they'll just realize that what they wanted all along, right? But that doesn't
Yeah.
really seem to work. In my experience, uh, when I've had friends who are worried about a relationship ending, it does. Um, so, but I'm wondering if there's kind of an acute anxious attachment style that people experience when.
Certainly has the similarities, but it probably is not. If it's not something that is repeated,
Mm-hmm.
and not something that's so if it's something that happens again and again and again, I can see how it would develop into an anxious attachment style.
Mm-hmm.
But if it happens once, it's likely that the person
Mm-hmm.
will just recover and not necessarily become anxiously attached. But
Okay.
you could characterize it as an acute form of anxious attachment.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's the anxious behavior. So the showing too much affection and trying to beg the other person or plead, and all of those behaviors are definitely not good behaviors if the relationship is not working out and the other person is pulling away.
Right. So what would somebody do if they kind of recognize they have that attachment style?
Yeah, I think the best you can do is to control your behavior. So you would have to implement some tools to prevent your behavior from being so obvious. So it's behavior, of course, can become a habit, and so you may be able to change your attachment style that way. But you have to put some restrictions on yourself
Mm-hmm.
and sort of control your behavior. And if you really feel like showering the other person with affection and attention, you might want to step back and look at your own behavior and see if there's a balance in the relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Restrict your behavior, and then maybe over time that can become a habit, such that you can learn perhaps that by letting go you actually come out stronger. That you're actually in a much worse position if you're the person who is chasing after the other person, right? You're in a much worse position.
Right.
You actually have a much more powerful position if you are not the person chasing the other person. So I think it becomes sort of, you can condition yourself to avoid that kind of behavior.
Okay.
What do you think, what are there other things you can do to get out of an anxious attachment style?
Well, I think sometimes for some people it's almost like a type of obsessive compulsive disorder where they can't, where it's where you kind of lose sight of the rational reasons and your memories that kind of led up to it, and then it's just you act in an anxious way to just satisfy some kind of compulsive desire. And I think in that case it can be a lot harder to recognize when you're acting that way. I think that might be the point where you go see a therapist to kind of help you navigate.
There it is, the anxious attachment style and obsessive compulsive disorder, because the obsessive thoughts need some kind of satisfaction,
Mm-hmm.
and that leads to that compulsive behavior. So you might tell yourself, okay, I shouldn't send my partner 14 text messages while he's at work.
Mm-hmm.
But then if you have a lot of obsessive thoughts, then maybe that makes you feel better by sending those 14 text messages. And that's probably the time when you need to work with a psychologist, maybe go through some cognitive behavioral training to break the pattern.
Because just for our listeners, there is no circumstance in which receiving 14 text messages at work, unless you're, a family member is in grave illness,
right,
will ever be warranted and received happily.
Right.
Just in case anyone's wondering.
Yeah.
So if you do that, you have probably
have a problem.
an anxious attachment style.
Yes, definitely.
Well, do you have anything else for today?
I think that was about it for today. Maybe I'll talk more about these attachment styles in a later episode.
Yeah. All right.
All
Well,
right. So
thanks
this
for
was
listening
the
or watching.
Super Mind channel. Good to talk to you, Kristian.
Good to talk to you.
All right. Take care.